Hi everyone and welcome to this episode of Keipert Labs. In today's video we're going to be looking at the case study of the disappearance of Azaria Chamberlain. Thinking about how the application of different forensic techniques in this particular case has shed new light on a very controversial particular example. Okay, so we'll give you a bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to go through some of the background of the case. It's very famous, but just to talk through some of the facts of this particular case. The forensic evidence that was laid out as part of the prosecution's argument, some of the problems that we have now been able to see with the forensic evidence, and then the next steps that followed, and then some conclusions we can draw. Okay, so Azaria Chamberlain was the baby of Lindy and Michael Chamberlain, who were tourists who were visiting near Uluru in 1980. On August 17, Azaria Chamberlain disappears from their tent at a campsite near Uluru. You can see over here, so roughly where their tent was, near an Aboriginal camp here, and then at some of the different kind of sites that became important as time went on. Okay, so Lindy, the mother, argued that the dingo came into their tent and took Azaria Chamberlain from their tent, which was a concept which was very controversial and surprising to many at that point. And so then the prosecution became suspicious. Later on, that there was a bloodied and torn jumpsuit, which was Azaria's, which was found nearby. And so you can see the actual kind of the bloody sort of stains, and then some of the tears that were present around the jumpsuit with an old 2-cent piece for scale. And so based on the evidence that was presented there and some of the original, some of the other evidence that was available, that the police suspected that Azaria was murdered by the Chamberlains inside their car and then the body was disposed of. So they didn't believe the dingo, the theory about a dingo taking the baby. And so then they, based on that particular scenario, then they were collecting evidence and interpreting it accordingly. So some of the other evidence that was discovered or that was used in this case was a suspected bloodstain found inside the Chamberlain's car. So the forensic biologist who was responsible for this used 2 tests to be able to confirm the presence of blood. So called the orthotolidine test, which was used to identify that it was blood, and then an antibody-based test to confirm that it was what we call fetal hemoglobin, or hemoglobin F, so suggesting that it was the blood of a child of younger than 6 months of age. So then, this being used to be consistent with the idea that the body was transported in their car, so that Azaria was killed in the car and then the body transported to be dumped somewhere else. Some of the other evidence was the bloody jumpsuit, a nappy and a singlet was also found with blood and damage to it. A bloody handprint on the clothing was found sometime later, suggesting that that was the Chamberlain, Lindy's hand during the commission of the crime. And then also a tear on the jumpsuit fabric, which was suggested to be from scissors, which were found in their car. So using that scissors were used during the murder, and that the tear was too neat to be from a dingo attack. So these were some of the evidence that was used. So it was all very what we call circumstantial evidence. There was nothing directly conclusive that suggested that Lindy Chamberlain killed her daughter and then disposed of the body, but they're all interpreting this evidence according to that particular narrative. And so then what happened was that in 1982, after originally a finding that by a coroner that a dingo had taken the baby and they were not suspected, but then eventually they were charged and Lindy was committed to trial for murder. And then in late October of 1982 that Lindy was found guilty. Michael Chamberlain was also convicted of being an accessory to murder with an 18-month suspended sentence, whereas Lindy got a mandatory life sentence for murder. And so you can see here that these are some of the forensic scientists examining their car, which was dismantled and examined for forensic purposes during the case. But we get to some of the problems with some of this evidence that was presented. Now, this particular case was incredibly well publicised. Like, it was the first, in Australia, the first kind of trial by media that was really around. And so there was a whole lot of speculation and a lot of public intrigue and gossip around this case. And so lots of, which had a big impact on how this case was interpreted, and how, people judging before they actually knew all of the facts. Okay, so the bloodstain which was found in the car. So the initial test of orthotolidine, which was used to confirm the presence of blood, is a presumptive test, not a confirmatory test. So it can identify a stain which may be blood, but it cannot confirm that it is definitely blood. And the problem with this is that it can cross-react with copper. Now, the Chamberlains lived in Mount Isa, which is near a copper mine. So copper is in the air all through Mount Isa, and so copper, particles kind of coming from the air in the dust all around the town. And so, on their car, which had driven from Mount Isa to Uluru, it's quite reasonable that there would be a copper residue on the car. Secondly, the fetal hemoglobin test that was used, so the antibody-based test, which is a bit like we would do for blood typing, can cross-react with iron. And so the same sort of thing, that, iron oxides in the red sands and, and things that might have been present on the car and in the paint as well, could give a false positive result. They didn't test any nearby surfaces or substrates, so they didn't actually, couldn't detect whether other things that didn't allegedly have blood had those same kind of results. And then subsequent testing of the suspected bloodstain using infrared spectroscopy showed that it was a paint emulsion from when the car was manufactured called Dewfix, but it was not blood at all. So not only was it not fetal blood, it was not blood in the slightest. So they got a very strong false positive result. Secondly, the bloodied handprint, which was detected or found on the clothing, was spectrophotometry was used to confirm the presence of blood, which is not a conclusive test. But the handprint itself was actually barely visible. It required a lot of seeing things that aren't there to be able to identify it. And also that the suspected stain was not blood at all, but was dust, from the red sandy dust from where the jacket was found. So containing iron oxide, so which would give a similar sort of reaction to blood in many respects. Now, the torn jumpsuit. So there was rigorous subsequent testing done with many different scenarios as to whether it was plausible that a canine like a dingo could have caused the damage. This is one such test kind of photograph that we found, so which showed that it was plausible for a canine to make the tear marks similar to those found on the jumpsuit. Okay, that they assumed that it could only be one particular way, but it showed that it could be many different ways. And then in 1986, Azaria's bloodied matinee jacket was found near dingo dens, not far from where the original incident occurred. And so this was sufficient to reopen the case to suggest that perhaps that there was merit to their claim after all. So then what happened from there? And in February 1986, that Lindy Chamberlain was released from prison on remission. In 1988, that the Northern Territory Court of Criminal Appeal overturns their convictions, so legally they are innocent. In 1992, some years later, that the Chamberlains receive over $1.3 million in compensation for the wrongful convictions, including their legal costs, as well as payment for the pain and suffering that they endured for Lindy being in prison for that long, for a crime she didn't commit. And then many years later, in 2012, that a fourth coronial inquest, so where a coroner looks into the matter, finds that the cause of Azaria's death was as a result of being attacked and taken by a dingo. Because even though their convictions were overturned, that then legally that it was an open finding as to what had happened. So there was always a question mark about their guilt. Whereas now with this finding to show that it was in fact a dingo, that then helps to kind of close the matter. So some of the conclusions about this, showing that the new forensic techniques that were able to be used allowed analysis of the evidence that was previously not possible or was not reliable. So the infrared spectroscopy in particular could help to show that it was not a bloodstain after all. And we needed more thorough and more scientific forensic procedures at the crime scene, at the analysis of evidence, correcting mistakes of the past, and giving us more careful scientific interpretation of the circumstantial evidence that was there. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.